Dear viewers, thank you so much for your attention and support. Please subscribe to our channel, give a like, and leave a comment. Your support means a lot to us.
It is difficult to imagine searching for a criminal without modern technology. Reality is far from detective fiction, so until recently there were thousands of episodes in the archives of unsolved cases. Now, forensic scientists have cutting-edge achievements in their hands. Finally, all the secrets become clear. Many criminals are tormented by a sense of guilt. Sometimes it even helps to obtain a confession and understand what prompted a person to commit something terrible. But there are also opposite situations, when a sense of guilt and fear of justice force only a cowardly escape, taking all the secrets with you. In August 1983, a 40-year-old woman named Priscilla Stroll lived in Fairfield, California, USA. She was a single mother raising a 15-year-old son named Kyle. The woman broke up with her husband, after which she devoted herself entirely to raising the child. Priscilla worked hard and long, tried to build a romantic relationship, but failed. So by August, she focused on giving her son everything he needed, and on weekends she met with relatives and friends. By this time, the city's population was about 60,000 people. Priscilla and her son lived in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood where everyone was nice and knew everyone else. It was less hectic than the rest of Fairfield. August 31st, she liked the laid-back 1983, was a normal day for Priscilla and her son Kyle. At 7:30 p.m., the 15-year-old son asked his mother for permission to meet his friends. He wanted to hang out for a few hours because he had to go to school the next day. The walk was the last chance to spend time carefree, not to think about anything during the holidays. The woman was not against it, but asked him to come home by 10 p.m. to have time to get ready for school and get some sleep. Kyle promised and kept his word. He returned a little earlier, at 9:45 p.m., and immediately knocked on the door for his mother to open it for him. The schoolboy had forgotten his keys, which was usually not a problem. But this time, there was August silence. 31st, 1983. His mother was in no hurry to open the door. Priscilla and her son Kyle. At 7:30 p.m., the 15-year-old son asked his mother for permission to meet his friends. He wanted to hang out for a few hours because he had to go to school the next day. The walk was the last chance to spend time carefree, not to think about anything during the holidays. The woman was not against it, but asked him to come home by 10 p.m. to have time to get ready for school and get some sleep. Kyle promised and kept his word. He returned a little earlier, at 9:45 p.m., and immediately knocked on the door for his mother to open it for him. The schoolboy had forgotten his keys, which was usually not a problem. But this time, there was silence. It seemed strange because the lights were on in the windows, in no hurry to and open the woman's car was in the driveway. So, she was home. The woman always waited for her son to return. She wouldn't go to bed until he came, because the teenager needed to be controlled. Kyle knocked a few more times, but again, no one responded. The schoolboy tried to figure out what had happened and walked around the area around the house, looking into the windows. In one of them, he saw his mother's legs, apparently lying on the floor. He assumed that she might be sick, panicked, and so used the window, which was usually left open. The teenager managed to open it, and Kyle immediately saw a scene of struggle. Many things were scattered. He called his mother, but no one responded. So the son continued walking. "I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request." When they opened the door, the teenager began screaming in panic that something terrible had happened to his mother. A neighbor called 911. Within minutes, Several patrol cars and paramedics were outside the Stroll's home to help the woman. The death of 40-year-old Priscilla Stroll was confirmed at the scene. The woman's condition was heartbreaking. Detectives had never seen such brutality before. The victim suffered multiple injuries, mostly concentrated in the face and head area. An autopsy revealed that the woman had been beaten to death, receiving dozens of blows, including stabbing, cutting, and blunt force trauma. In addition, the forensic expert concluded that the woman had been raped. This allowed the collection of the criminal's biological fluids from her body. Priscilla had been subjected to a lengthy execution. There was a large kitchen
several
knife,
objects
a can
were used
opener,
at
and a
once.
decorative tree that stood in one of the rooms. All of these items were taken from the house and sent to the lab for testing. The scale showed the degree of cruelty. It was assumed that she was attacked by a man who was filled with hatred. He was probably under the influence of some substance that caused him to lose control. The woman put up a fierce fight. In addition to the injuries that caused her death, she had multiple defensive wounds. Given the severity and duration of the attack, it was assumed that the perpetrator may have also injured him. When the forensic experts worked in the house, they managed to record several important points at once. Firstly, the door to the house had not been broken down. When examining the windows, they also failed to find any traces of penetration, except for the window Kyle had climbed through, indicating that the victim likely knew her killer and willingly let him in. Additionally, many objects and furniture were broken and scattered, indicating a prolonged standoff. The victim's son said several items were missing. These included the woman's jewelry box and her purse. However, the brutality of the attack did not. It seemed that he had come here with the express purpose of raping and killing the woman. The most valuable evidence found in the house were several fingerprints of the alleged killer, as well as a DNA sample from the victim's body. Everything that was collected began to be carefully analyzed. About a month after the murder, the fingerprints were checked through the identification system. It had only recently been introduced into law enforcement agencies, but was already widely used by the police. The database contained fingerprints of registered criminals, but it was still very limited. Unfortunately, no matches were found. DNA analysis methods were just beginning to appear at that time, and they were far. It was possible to determine the criminal's blood type, but that was all. The profile sources were collected, carefully documented, and also sent to the archive. The police continued to search for the criminal. They talked to neighbors who should have heard the noise of the struggle at the very moment of the attack. Perhaps a suspicious person was seen near Priscilla's house. Unfortunately, the neighbor was not in the house that day, except for Kyle's friend, who lived one house away. But he was too far away to hear anything. No witnesses were found. CCTV cameras were not yet common. No one on this street had them. However, law enforcement. It was believed that the victim knew her killer, so they began checking her immediate circle. Several suspects emerged at once. Among them was Kyle's biological father. The man had no criminal history. He denied involvement in the death of his ex-wife. Rather, he seemed like a man who was genuinely worried about what had happened. He was most concerned about his son, who was going through a lot of shock at the time after finding his dead mother. The ex-husband's relationship with Priscilla was described as fairly reserved and friendly. They had quietly. After that, the man maintained relations with his son, communicated calmly with his wife. There were no conflicts or division of property between them. His words were confirmed by everyone who knew the couple well. The man insisted that he was not involved in the crime and provided an alibi. He was out of town at the time. After multiple witnesses corroborated his story, Kyle's biological father was eliminated as a suspect. Detectives then checked for sex offenders and registered sex offenders who lived near the Strowls' home. However, all these people had reliable alibis, and their involvement could not be proven. In the woman's immediate circle, there were no more conflicts. Everyone described her as a calm, good-natured woman who devoted her life to her child. She didn't look like the type of person who would cause anger. But it didn't look like a random attack or robbery either. There seemed to be a personal motive: anger, hatred, jealousy. They tried to find possible men from Priscilla's life with whom she could have built romantic relationships, but none were found. In the absence of leads, they even turned their attention to Kyle himself. The young man was the last known person to see his mother alive. He also used a suspicious way to get inside the house, through a barely open window. His relationship with Priscilla had been calm. Beginning of the transition period, mother and son had had some disagreements from time to time. He himself was horrified when he was suspected of killing his mother. However, the young man was also quickly crossed off the list, as it was possible to confirm that he was in the company of friends at the time of the attack on the woman. He simply did not have time to do all this. Kyle was very upset by the death of his mother. Even without the increased interest of law enforcement, he needed serious psychological support. But even after that, he never fully recovered. In the following years, Kyle lived with his father, continuing to suffer. The young man took medication to stabilize his emotional state. He repeatedly spoke to the media and said that he would not be able to live peacefully while his mother's killer was walking free. The police appealed to the public for help. A press conference was held in which the murder of the Priscilla Stroll was described in detail. After that, the police station received several calls from concerned local residents, but no one was able to provide any valuable information. The investigation gradually stalled. Repeated checks yielded no results. Even despite the public outrage, there were no leads. Given the level of forensic science at the time, it's not surprising. The locals, they wanted to stop the dangerous killer before he struck again. Because of this, worried citizens often contacted the police station, but this only escalated the situation without bringing any real benefit. After some time, all the collected materials and data were sent to the archive. In the following years, several attempts were made to reopen the investigation. It was believed that a person capable of such a thing would inevitably strike again. The accumulated information was analyzed, but this only added to the dead end direct. Back in the 90s, it was suggested that the woman could have been the victim of a serial killer who moved between cities and committed spontaneous attacks. Several known serial killers who had been caught by that time and who were active in this area were checked. However, all denied involvement in Priscilla's death. However, this idea was quickly abandoned when databases with DNA materials of these people were created. After comparison, not a single match was found. The situation changed only in early 2012, when 29 years had passed since the murder. The case of Priscilla Stroll fell into the hands of one of the detectives who was included in crimes. Looking through the collected evidence, he noticed that there were fingerprints as well as a DNA sample of the killer. Obviously, it is difficult to imagine more informative sources of information. A detailed examination of the case materials showed that the greatest attention was paid to DNA. The fact is that the attack was recognized as sexually motivated. It was believed that the killer could not have just come to such a brutal murder, which means that he had similar episodes before and after 1983. At that time, databases were already beginning to appear in which such criminals were entered. However, against this background, fingerprints remained in the background. By April 2012, it was decided the samples were sent to a forensic lab, previously using profiles that were too old and therefore not accurate enough given the limited capabilities. Now they decided to update the data. The source was enough to get a full DNA profile of the criminal in a few months. Having the profile of the offender, it was decided to compare it with the existing CODIS database. To the surprise of law enforcement, again, not a single match was found. This was misleading, since the brutality of the crime was beyond measure. It seemed that a person capable of such a thing would never stop. Detectives were sure that he had to be included in the database by committing at least one more similar crime. Given that there were no coincidences, or life circumstances, or other crimes committed by his hands were also unsolved. However, Priscilla and Stroll were in no hurry to return the case to the archive. They noted that there were fingerprints, although they could be considered less valuable evidence than the DNA profile. They also decided to check them against existing databases of registered criminals. They had already been checked several times, but not against modern databases, but against outdated ones that appeared back in 1983. They were also a source of important information, but they contained significantly less data than the updated ones. By January 2014, the collected materials were sent to a lab that specialized in fingerprint analysis. Finally, after 3 decades of trying and failing, the cops had a hit. The prime suspect was Robert Hathaway, who by now was a 48-year-old Fairfield resident. Naturally, more data was needed before an arrest. It was quickly discovered that the man had a long history of crimes. None of them even came close to the scale of the woman's murder. This indirectly confirmed that he could have been under the influence of illegal substances. At the time of the massacre, Robert was significantly younger than the victim. He was only 17 years old, so it seemed unlikely that they were in a relationship or had a disagreement. However, the love triangle version was not ruled out either. The answer Everything had yet to be verified. Finally, after 3 decades of trying and failing, the cops had a hit. The prime suspect was Robert Hathaway, who by now was a 48-year-old Fairfield resident. Naturally, more data was needed before an arrest. It was quickly discovered that the man had a long history of crimes. None of them even came close to the scale of the woman's murder. This indirectly confirmed that he could have been under the influence of illegal substances. At the time of the massacre, Robert was significantly younger than the victim. He was only 17 years old, so it seemed unlikely that they were in a relationship or had a disagreement. However, the love triangle version was not ruled out either. Robert was arrested for burglary in December 1986, 3 years after Priscilla's murder. It turns out that his fingerprints were entered into the government's database during this period. However, no subsequent attempts were made to check them. When the reinvestigation of the crime was initiated, they relied only on the DNA profile. When detectives wanted to inform Kylo that they now knew who killed his mother, and at the same time ask a few questions about Robert, it turned out that he did not live to see this day. He died 10 years before the reinvestigation. At this time, he was only 35 years old. The details of the young man's life that led him to such an early end were not disclosed. However, some of the family members interviewed later were sure that he could not cope with the loss of his mother, and this undermined his health. To find out about Roberta, they met with the only close relative of the deceased, who knew her well enough. It turned out to be her brother, Ron Whitted. The man lived nearby in Fairfield. Until his last day, he was in close contact with the heroine of the story and her son. He knew that Robert was a friend of Kylo's, and even visited him. In the 80s, Robert was known as a rebellious. He was repeatedly seen in bad company. Ron was sure that he was systematically drinking in the early 80s and also using illegal substances. According to rumors, at such moments the young man became uncontrollable, which led to problems with the law. He was jailed after a robbery in 1986, but was quickly released because it was the young man's first criminal episode. Ron remembered that after his release, Robert seemed to have reformed and later even started a family. The man was surprised that Robert was capable of such brutal violence, because in the following decades, no trace of violence was noticed in him. The year of the murder, the criminal, acquainted with the victim's son. Unfortunately, Kyle himself could no longer provide investigators with any valuable information. It was known that the teenagers attended the same school. Robert Hatoy came to visit them several times. This confirmed the version that the woman voluntarily let the killer into the house. They did know each other well. She trusted the young man, as did everyone, not expecting him to be prone to violence. However, this was the problem. Since fingerprints in such a case were not strong enough evidence to bring charges, a skilled lawyer could easily use Robert's acquaintance and visits. Naturally, the police wanted to get a DNA sample of the prime suspect to compare with the existing profile after the rape and irrefutably prove or disprove his involvement in the murder. At this time, Robert lived in the house with his wife. Their children had long since grown up and moved out. The police spoke to the couple's closest circle. Everyone described Cheetah Hatoy as ordinary, unremarkable people. Robert was not violent or aggressive. He didn't seem like a bloodthirsty killer. He had a history of crimes, but they were all related to theft. Several other witnesses confirmed that after being arrested on robbery charges, the troubled young man decided to turn the corner. There were no strange why such a person could even take up arms and kill a woman in such a brutal way. We talked to the man's wife, but she did not notice anything unusual in his behavior in all the years of their life together. Their relationship lasted for many years. During all this time, he never showed cruelty towards her. She did not believe at all that her husband could be involved in something like that. On February 11, 2014, investigators decided to talk to Robert Hathaway in person. They went to his home where he lived with his wife. Robert confirmed
They talked to
that he
him
knew
about
her
the death
and
of
her
Priscilla
son.
Stroll.
They had been in contact for a long time, visiting each other. However, he denied that he was involved in the attack and rape of the woman. According to the suspect, he was with Kyle and a group of friends the entire night of the attack. They broke up around 9:30 p.m. and went home. He was cooperative with law enforcement, so the police did not even need to use a court order to
Robert
forcibly
allowed the
obtain a
collection of
DNA
material
sample.
voluntarily.
Detectives carefully observed him during the conversation and noticed that Robert was nervous. Although his behavior and appearance were indeed far from what dangerous killers usually look like. In any case, it was only possible to prove or disprove his involvement after DNA testing and comparison with the existing profile. Seeing off the detectives, Robert's wife emphasized that she was sure that her husband was not involved in the murder, and that all this was the result of some mistake. She was assured that in this case he would not face any prosecution by the police. After this meeting, the police immediately handed
Since
over
we were
the
talking
collected
about
materials to the laboratory
2014,
for
the
examination.
result
The result could be obtained in less than 2 weeks. Time was not wasted. They were able to find one of Kyle's friends, to whom the teenager went on those fateful evenings of 1983. But according to him, Robert was not in the company. They had little contact with him at all, as he was 2 grades ahead of them. The lie of the prime suspect became another valuable but indirect confirmation of his guilt. The detectives eagerly prepared for the arrest and the filing of charges based on fingerprints. They were very sure that Robert had killed the Priscilla. On February 15th, 2014, Robert's wife went to the police station. The woman was terrified and asked the police to come to the house where they had been a few days earlier.
When they arrived at the scene, they found a 48-year-old man hanged.
An investigation into the case showed that he had taken his own life. In the same room, a short note was found on the table that had been left on the deceased. He wrote it to his beloved wife and emphasized that he had chosen a cowardly way out of this situation. Unfortunately, the suspect did not provide any comments or confessions about whether he was really involved in the murder of the woman. However, it was necessary to bring the matter to an end. Detectives examined his computer and mobile phone. In the days before his suicide, he had made numerous browser requests for DNA testing. He was particularly realizing in how reliable such indisputable pieces of evidence. Robert realized that he had no chance of avoiding conviction. However, they were still in no hurry to make loud statements, waiting for the examination to be completed. On February 20th of the same year, the police received the results of the laboratory analysis. "I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request." After that, law enforcement agencies spoke at an official press conference and announced that the case of the press force Stroll was considered solved, but it was impossible to bring the killer and rapist to justice, since he voluntarily took his own life. Now it was obvious, but it was still unclear why he had attacked a woman old enough to be his mother as a teenager. It was a real shock for Robert's wife and children. No one expected that he could carry this terrible secret within himself for 3 decades. In an attempt to clear his name, it was suggested that Robert had only raped the woman and that an accomplice might have killed her. However, the initial investigation did not provide any reason to believe that more than one person was involved in the attack. No fingerprints were found at the
Fairfield
crime
Police
scene
Department
except Robert's. Special thanks to all the units that contributed to the case, including the California Bureau of Forensic Science and the Salem Circle Fingerprint Bureau. Although Priscilla Stahl's son never lived to see his mother's murder solved, she still had living relatives. They were pleased that the case was finally solved and the brutal killer would be unable to hurt anyone else. But not everyone shared that sentiment. The disappointment of Ron Whitehead's brother victim knew no bounds when he learned that Robert had taken his own life. Under state law, he could have faced the death penalty if convicted. That was the outcome he wanted, so he could be there when the killer received his lethal injections and look into his eyes before justice was done.